We're going to hear about a topic that's of particular interest to me, although it's not all about me, but we're seeing a lot of patients with severe hearing loss with NF2, of course, now that we have a neurofibromatosis center, so it's particularly interesting for me to hear Dr. Ruffin's presentation. He has been here in Seattle for about a year, although he trained here some years ago before that, but came from Chicago. He's a ENT, I'm going to say ENT, but is that a correct, or are you a neuro-otologist?
I do general ENT and then subspecialize in otology.
Good. And has done a lot of work in hearing issues. So thank you very much for being here. Is your presentation ready? Welcome.
Well, oh yeah, I'm presenting off my computer. Thank you. So I'm a general ENT. I work at Minor and James just up the street. I came here about 11 months ago, still building up a private practice. I grew up with hearing loss. I was born deaf. I used hearing aids much through high school, elementary school, high school, college, got cochlear implants my last year of college. Ended up getting a second cochlear implant when I was an internship. And then I specialize, I do research for implants, I do technology development for developing new speech coding strategies for cochlear implants, as well as looking at how to help people function better with hearing loss. Oh, I know what the problem is. I'll just shorten the cable.
Yeah, it's like another deck.
What's that? So, yeah.
Try that one.
Dongle Rama. So we're going to discuss the impact of hearing loss and a little bit about cochlear implants, how they work, what their shortcomings are, how they've changed over time. And then we're also going to talk about assistive technology, why it's insufficient to actually improve the quality of life for people with hearing loss. Over the past few years, we've kind of come to understand that hearing loss is not just a sensory deficit. It's not just a problem of saying, ha, and asking people to repeat themselves. We now know that mild hearing loss in a single ear in a child doubles the risk for failure of a grade, and that grade failure is a catastrophic event that will stay with them for the rest of their life. Untreated hearing loss is associated with $22,000 more per decade of healthcare spending. It's the #1 modifiable risk factor for dementia. It's associated with falls, cardiovascular disease, increased length of hospital stay, readmission. The loneliness that is associated with hearing loss is worse for mortality than obesity, smoking cigarettes, and physical inactivity. The employment rate of deaf and hard of hearing people is only a half of that of normal hearing people, and the income rate is earnings is also half of that. Hearing healthcare in America is largely abysmal. Only about 20% of people who need hearing aids get them, and only about 5% of people who qualify for cochlear implants get them. And even of those subset of patients who are actively getting technology, they usually wait at least a decade before getting it. So a cochlear implant candidate on average waits about 12 years before they actually get an implant, and a person who needs a hearing aid waits about 10 years. So this talk is going to focus more on the rehabilitation of people for whom hearing aids do not benefit. So, cochlear implants. They are a system where a processor is worn behind the ear, which is the pointer, part A of this, or this right here. The sound goes in a microphone. The speech or sound stimuli is digitized, passed through an antenna that sticks on a magnet. This link hooks up to an internal receiver stimulator, which decodes that signal and then fires a multiple electrode array in the cochlea. The important point to remember is you hear with your brain, not your ear. You can give the same stimulation to different people with pretty similar presentations of hearing loss and have completely different results. This is how an implant basically works. In the cochlea, you have a tonotopic arrangement of fibers where at the basal turn of the cochlea, then the fibers are sensitive to higher frequencies, and it becomes mathematically predictive way, more and more sensitive to lower pitches as you go further into the cochlea. This is the only thing that cochlear implants really take advantage of in terms of stimulating. So our primary goal is to send high-frequency information in this 3-channel implant to the high-frequency part of the cochlea, and then mid-frequency to the mid part, and low to the lower frequency part. So you can see up here, like the sound, the word northwest is divided into a low-frequency component, mid, and high-frequency. The envelope, or relatively the amplitude information from that channel, is then applied to a pulse train, and the pulse train carries that information down to the cochlea. The interesting thing about these, there's all kinds of permutations of speech coding strategies, but we really haven't been able to change the electroneural interface in about the last 20 years. No matter what people have done, either try to increase the rate of pulses by a magnitude of 10, try to do better temporal coding and get the neurofibers to fire in a way that's more similar to normal hearing people, just doesn't work. This is an audiogram of how we test hearing. On the top, you see frequency of pure tones. 125 is a man's voice is probably around 80 hertz. A woman's voice is probably around 180 hertz. And then as you get further and further over to the right of here, you get into consonant sounds. Here is about a pen dropping and leaves rustling. I'm talking probably about right down here. And then you can see the different icons. This is a lawnmower, and then a 747 on takeoff would be about right down here. So the only take-home point I want you to see from this, when we first started doing cochlear implants back in the 1980s, we took profoundly deaf people who really couldn't hear anything. So we've actually learned that the greater and greater residual hearing that you have prior to implantation, the better you will do. So we can implant people who have great low-frequency hearing, but because of lack of high-frequency discrimination, they do very, very, very poorly. And we now implant kids less than 12 months of age. We also do single-sided deafness. In normal hearing, your brainstem does quite a bit of sound processing to get absolutely amazing noise reduction in very noisy environments. But you need 2 great functioning ears to be able to do that. So when people who have single-sided deafness, they get a cochlear implant, they are able to fuse that information, but most of the 2-ear benefits they get is basically from their head blocking noise. So if noise is coming from this way and they have an implant on this side, they can hear on this side. They don't get much of the fancy noise reduction capability that you guys have. Forgot one point that I was going to make. This is implant surgery. This is looking at a right ear. This is the sigmoid sinus. This is the tegmen here. Anterior is on top. you're looking at the incus, which would be about laying right here. The chorda tympani is right here. The facial nerve is right there. And down in there, we have the round window of the cochlea. The surgery's changed in recent years to favor atraumatic insertion and electrode arrays that are much more atraumatic than years past. And that's actually where we've seen most of the benefit come from, and improvement in performance and decrease in variability between patients. After surgery, it takes about a year for patients to have their device frequently updated as they adapt to the cochlear implant. They come in several times over the next year. The rehabilitation is actually fairly passive. You can give people rehabilitation exercises, but the actual plateau of patients is not going to change between patients who get rehabilitation, people who don't. So it's actually really quite interesting how the brain is very plastic, but it does this in a way that's fairly passive to the user. There are one difference, caveat with that point, though, is pediatric patients, because adults who lose their hearing later in life, after they develop speech and language, they just need to be able to have access to sound and access to speech. Children are an entirely different population, because their primary reason for getting an implant is to develop spoken language and speech. They require much more intensive rehabilitation. You have to teach children not only how to listen, but also how to talk and how to respond. For example, I met a colleague yesterday in Bellingham, and her son has bilateral cochlear implants. And even though he's only 4 years old, we were saying bye, and I said bye, and he didn't say anything. His mother had to prompt him to say, "It was nice meeting you," or whatever it was. But you basically have to teach kids how to respond appropriately to the various things. As far as outcomes, at the very least, we tell patients that they will be able to hear environmental sounds. Patients, I would expect a late deafened adult to be able to hear about between 70 and 80% of what's being said in quiet. The noise performance is more variable, but it's generally better than getting endpoint with a hearing aid. About almost half of patients can talk on the telephone. Music is not appreciated in the same way with implantees as normal hearing people, because you don't have fine pitch perception with an implant. There are many, many implant patients who like music, but there's also a lot, particularly those who had normal hearing prior to implantation, who don't like the sound of music. Sound localization is fairly crude. It's mostly based on volume level differences between ears. Normal hearing people are able to use timing differences between ears. Sound arriving on my right side about 700 microseconds shorter than my left side, so sound is coming from here. People with normal hearing have a robust 3D representation of sound in their head. People with hearing loss don't have that. People with cochlear implants. Speech production typically improves after a cochlear implant. I very much had a deaf accent before I had my implant. And quality of life also improves. The interesting thing about quality of life, though, is if I give someone a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, their quality of life will go up. But there are number of robust studies that show that quality of life improvement is actually not related to how well they hear with the device. It's more related to how they connect with other people, and it's probably a proxy for their underlying behavior of getting out and taking care of themselves and getting technology. This is a very widely cited JAMA article showing the improvement of speech and language outcomes in kids with cochlear implantation. I just want you to look at the middle graph, and the only thing I want you to take away is this is looking at age after implantation, actual age normally, and this is looking at comprehension scores in speech. Normal hearing kids are these bars right here. Cochlear implant kids are these. So they do improve from an implant, but that improvement is widely variable. You can see the blue lines everywhere. In general, for cochlear implantees, there are several things that can affect this outcome. Duration of deafness. The longer that you have been deaf, you have greater atrophy of neural circuits. Age of implantation is less related to performance with a cochlear implant. Residual hearing prior auditory experience is definitely positively associated with speech perception. The etiology of hearing loss, mainly the types of etiologies that affect the electroneural interface, such as meningitis, can induce ossification and cause problems with the electroneural interface. Patients who have cognitive deficits don't do as well. And going back to this graph, for kids, family involvement, auditory training, and consistency of device use are highly, highly correlated. And I already said this before, but things that don't affect how well people with implants do with cochlear implants is generally, if you have a latest generation device within the last 10 years, you're not going to have a difference in your outcome. And the number of electrodes that you have in general with modern devices is not going to matter. Most devices provide over 16 electrodes. The maximum number of electrodes that people can functionally discriminate is about 16. So I'm now going to shift into telling you more of my experience with cochlear implants and why we need more than just technology just to improve the outcomes of hard of hearing people. The first time that I ever saw an implant surgery was about 15 years ago with Jay Rubenstein, who was my mentor at the University of Washington. The boy was a 4-year-old kid. He was born with hearing loss so severe that hearing aids are not going to help him develop normal speech and language outcomes. And even today, I still stop myself on the street and I think, like that is 100,000 pulses in my ear that recreate the soundscape that I can function much more normally. If I didn't have my implants, I do guarantee you I would be able to function and take care of airway cases. It would, and difficult things like that, but it would be harder. The difference between this boy and me is that he got his implant at the age of 4, and I waited for about 20 years. I teared up when I saw him get this and saw the little electrode go into his cochlea because I thought he would never experience the profound social isolation that comes when you can only really talk to one other person. That he wouldn't be sitting at a dinner table and be unable to chime in with his friends simply because he couldn't hear, or have people tell him, never mind, it's not important when he asked them to repeat something. Or I thought he would be able to go to a professional school and not have the chancellor of the professional school override the admissions committee's decision simply because he was deaf. I teared up because I thought that we'd really reached a zenith of possibilities for deaf people. But I was wrong. Where's this? Yeah. Before me, no other deaf person had successfully gone through a surgical training program with cochlear implants. I applied to ENT programs after medical schools. It took about 30 interviews over 2 years, a second research fellowship, and an extra year of internship before I was able to convince my field that I could take care of a patient gasping for oxygen in the middle of the night. That was about probably the most traumatic event I have ever experienced in my life. When I applied, I had already done a two-year Howard Hughes fellowship. I'd published on the far right of the bell curve as a medical student. I had spoken to heads of state about hearing loss. And on the side, I taught myself electrical engineering to develop a hearing aid to help myself here in the operating room. And I'd actually done all of these things out of pure passion. And when I did my residency interviews, I would frequently hear things like, oh, you're the deaf boy everyone's been talking about. And people would be skeptical. And, I was like, it would be really nice to have been greeted, with, you'd be a great addition to the team. So I sat on the sidelines for a couple of years, and I watched my colleagues with similar credentials get into really, really good programs. And before then, I had never, ever thought that I was different than anyone else. I'd never perceived myself to be a minority. But The residency program that I did get into is really, really cool because it's headed by the pioneer of pediatric cochlear implantation. One of the most widely cited papers in our field is by Richard Miyamoto, who's the chairman of Indiana University. And what was also really cool, the fellowship that I did at UW had to do more with speech coding in the auditory nerve. My research fellowship at Indiana University had more to do with studying the cognitive changes imposed by deafness. And this, I didn't see it then, but it turned out to be quite a powerful background for treating hearing loss. As I went through my residency program, I started to become profoundly aware of the limitations of cochlear implants. And these limitations are not obvious. And for super motivated people who really want to succeed at the very top, these can be severely limiting factors. And I was determined to overcome this problem, and I'm going to show you some of the issues with sound simulations. During the residency interview process, I was called shifty and aloof. I get that all the time, even now, actually. But during that time, it really stuck in my head. I couldn't figure out why. I drove down to Bloomington, Indiana, which is about an hour from Indianapolis, and I looked at this wonderful autism library. I tried to look to find some way to reconstruct the interview process, what's going on cognitively, so that we could learn from it. I'm going to play a simulation of a cochlear implant. And when you listen to it, I want you to pretend that you are listening as an interviewee for a job, or you're getting a performance review from your superior. Think about the stress and anxiety that you feel as a hearing-capable person, and then think about how it would be if you had to process everything in that room through the sound of a cochlear implant. Let me see if this will go. Did y'all hear that? Life is for living. You likely understand.
Life is for living.
You likely understand most or all of the words that are being said. Normally when I do this sound simulation, I get to the conference ahead of time and I record one of the people that everyone knows there, and I use their voice. And then people really understand that you can't tell who that voice is. You couldn't tell if it was Stephen Hawking or Darth Vader. But even more, you can't tell if that person is being sarcastic, if they're being funny. You don't know where they're from. It's harder to tell what their socioeconomic status is, their background. Are they sick that day? Are they tired? Are they interested in talking to you? The point is, in residency interviews, or interviews in general, people tamp down their body language. So how do I rapidly tell from the voice of an interviewer that they're thinking that I would be a great addition to the team, or if they're thinking that I might endanger a patient? How do I do all of this on the fly without sounding shifty and aloof, like a robot? So let's think about another issue. The automaticity of hearing is crucial. Remember, when you were listening to that sound simulation, you had to kind of mentally reach out and figure out what was being said. That reaching out is what we call cognitive load. I have a patient who is a lawyer, and he was late deafened, and he got his bilateral cochlear implants, and he does phenomenally well. He's one of the people who are sealing out on some of the most difficult speech presentation materials we can give him, even in noise. So I asked him, I was like, if I sit you in a conference room around a table, and you have 4 or 5 other people here, and your job is to negotiate the best possible contract for your client between these 4 or 5 people. No one's talking over one another. Each of them is talking one at a time, and everything's very polite, low stress. Can you do that? He's like, no, I can't. I spend so much time thinking about what is being said and trying to understand the words that I can't think 3 steps ahead to really guide the negotiations to the best outcome for my client. Now, this effect of hearing loss, cochlear implants on cognitive load and executive functioning sounds super obvious now that I've explained it. But when I was in the operating room, it gets even harder because this is a noise. There's masks, so I can't lip read. It's stressful, it's noisy, and people with hearing loss can really struggle. So when I hear, I have to parse individual words into sentences, think about what that sentence means, and then convert it into an action that my attending wanted me to do or learn something more about the anatomy. Trying to figure out what you're not hearing is super distracting. And all of this cognitive processing gets in the way of carrying on normal conversations. One of the feedbacks that I got in residency was that I didn't seem that interested in surgery. I'm like, hello, I get up every morning at 5 a.m., trudge in, I do like my job. Just because I'm around the operating table and not saying anything really means that I am like paying attention to everything that's going on, and I actually cannot be witty and super involved verbally. And even today, I still have to tell people this. Doing this effectively is, so now that you've kind of like reimagined the problem, you can see this not just about hearing, but it's about giving the brain room to do, to process what's being said, and to effectively perform the other functions that it's designed to do. And one of the primary functions of the brain is simply to connect with the other person that you're talking to. Doing this effectively is hard enough for someone who lost their hearing later in life. But what about that 4-year-old kid? What about me? I was born deaf. For those people who are born deaf and use degraded hearing of a cochlear implant to hear, you really can effectively hear with hearing alone and not lip reading only about 5 feet from your ears. Our entire social construct is built on information that we get in that small sphere of hearing. For normal hearing people, knowing what to say and when to say it and how to say it is conscious, but it's also visceral, and it's guided by years on years of social learning and hardwired social neural circuits that viscerally guide what you need to say. I've often thought about what to say in response to something that I hear, and I'm like, I have to think about it. I'm like, and I have to turn around and I say, would other people say this? And usually, sometimes the response is like, hell no. So I just keep my mouth shut. But the point is, it requires a lot of thought for me. So we have no way of counseling patients on cognitive load. Usually when patients get auditory rehabilitation, they are taught, all right, you need to sit with the person facing you, make sure everyone's well lit so you can receive the information. It's more strategies designed to get information and not really foster connections and interactions with other people. The patients aren't taught to do things that I figured out. For like example, the only thing visually that deaf people are better at is motion in the periphery visually. And because of cognitive load issues in the operating room, if I'm under a microscope, or if I'm doing sinus surgery, watching a TV, I turn the lights down to cut down on glare, and then I don't see everything else in the room. I don't need that, but it makes my job easier. So I appreciate that. I'm currently working with Hopkins and Texas to work on some evidence-based strategies for this. So what do I do these days? My goal is to treat severe and profound hearing loss in private practice and to translate some of these issues that I've talked with you into evidence-based practices for people with hearing loss. I have no way of telling a person with hearing loss who comes in to see me, like, if you do X, Y, and Z on your job, this is tied to better outcomes, like you'll make more money, you'll have more job satisfaction. There's nothing I can tell you with that. There's nothing that I can tell a patient, if you do X, Y, and Z with your wife, spouse, you will have better relationships. We actually had a really cool research finding. So based on some research I did at UW, I came up with a different way to fire the electrodes of an implant. And I originally designed this to improve sound quality and try to address some of the issues of cognitive load, because all of the speech perception research with cochlear implants focuses on how many words correct people are getting. There's never an issue of talking about what the sound quality sounds like or cognitive change, addressing the cognitive changes. So I came up with a way to do this And the side effect was that people really liked music a lot better. I had a couple of patients telling me that the bass perception with this new strategy was basically like having normal hearing or approaching normal hearing again. I already talked about outcomes-based counseling strategy. I also work in a startup that's kind of on a back burner right now to create some hearing assistive technology. One of our competitors on which this technology is somewhat loosely based, if you look at their page for their leadership, they have no people who are in their target disability demographic in their company. The number of people with hearing loss in hearing research is pretty low, and I've never actually met anyone with hearing loss from the hearing aid companies. So improving representation will go a long way. Yeah. So I enjoy flying planes, and it's really easy to get distracted by what's in front of you, and because it's just so pretty. I think turning around and looking behind is really nice. You can get good pictures, get good views, especially when the night is in front of you and the sun sets behind you. But it was a really long journey for me to get here to where I am, but I really enjoy my job. I really enjoy taking care of patients, and I've learned a lot. So thank you for having me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes, sir.
So what part of the hearing apparatus has to be intact for this to work? I presume the cochlear nerve has to still work, correct?
Correct. So with children, we often will, we would generally get an MRI to make sure that the cochlear nerve is intact. For adults who have normal hearing, we don't do that. For patients who have acoustic tumors, we used not to implant them because we presumed that their nerve would not be working, but that is now on the cusp of changing, and people are starting to be a little bit more aggressive with that.
So in the case of meningitis, isn't that usually a cochlear nerve damage?
The outcomes are worse with meningitis, and it's thought to be from the ossification of the cochlea or bony growth that starts immediately after meningitis. So the key with that population is to get an MRI, make sure there's fluid in the cochlea, and very rapidly, over the course of weeks, do an implant before you get ossification of the cochlea, so you can insert the full electrode array.
I see. And can you walk through your device again? I got lost somewhere between the radio and the...
Walk through the device?
Can
Yeah.
you tell us about that again?
So, like, tell me how I hear with it and stuff?
How does it work?
How does it work? So sound goes in. This is the microphone right here at the tip. There's a little bit of, you hear a little bit better because your satellite ears focuses sound a little bit. This is the processor right here. Over the years, it's changed from this tiny little thing from when I first got one with a pack of cigarettes, essentially in my pocket. This is the battery, lasts about 8 hours, 8 to 10 hours, depending on the configuration. So sound goes in the microphone, is digitized by the processor, goes out to the antenna. This is a magnet that's on my head. There's nothing through the skin. There's a computer right here. That computer has an electrode that goes down into the cochlea, and the signal goes to that computer. The computer decodes the signal, tells which electrode to fire and for how long. Does that help?
So it's like Bluetooth from the device?
No, that would be way too band limited, way too slow. It is a proprietary 2.5 gigahertz connection. And it's not safe, so you could theoretically, safe meaning that secure. So theoretically, you could like fire radio across to me. Have some antenna or hacker out there like firing radio at me and activating my implant, and like I don't know, turn me into a schizophrenic really quickly.
How much do they cost?
The internal component is $20,000. This thing is about $8,000, brand new. I don't have insurance on it, so it causes quite a bit of consternation when I lose it. The surgery altogether is about $50,000. Generally covered by insurance. Medicare is stingy. Medicare pays it, but you have to have worse hearing than. So generally, if you can hear less than 60% of words correct, monosyllabic words correct in the sound booth, you are going to benefit from an implant, and your benefit will be greater than with the hearing aids that you're getting. It will be very, very rare for me to make your hearing worse with an implant if you're hearing 60% or below. Medicare, however, requires that you hear 40% or below in the ear to be implanted, and then 60% or below in the opposite ear. So it creates a problem with patients because they get a unilateral implant and then they go to bilateral, and technically they're hearing it. No, talking about single-sided deafness, sorry. But yes, it's generally covered by insurance.
Do you know anything about brainstem auditory implants and how much discrimination, hearing restoration they can provide compared to a cochlear implant?
Much less. So we have auditory midbrain implants and we have auditory brainstem implants. The auditory brainstem implants, there are two key populations. One, people who have neurofibromatosis and people who do not. People who have neurofibromatosis have much worse outcomes. I don't remember off the top of my head the people who don't have neurofibromatosis, but if you have neurofibromatosis, if you're just generally getting it just for lip reading to help you hear the cadence of speech, if you have some other etiology of hearing loss and you get an auditory brainstem implant, there's a chance, but it's not very high, that you'll be able to talk on the telephone. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much.